When someone imagines fighting games, the immediate image that comes to mind are two players battling it out for the win, either on an arcade machine, sitting next to each other on a console, or even battling across the world online. More than almost any other genre of video game, fighting games are, by nature, multiplayer games. Starting all the way back in arcades, leading into the million-dollar tournaments of today, the goal has always been to test your skills against another human being, but in a growing world of video games, making a game that's only good for competition is a difficult task. Even today, many fighting games are criticized for not having enough single-player content, especially as game prices only go higher and higher. An unfortunate example of this was Street Fighter V. A game that released infamously bare-boned with almost no single-player content on release, forcing players to wait for almost 5 months for a story mode DLC. Of course, the original fighting games came from arcades, where two players could put in coins at the same time to fight each other. But if you were alone, then you would face increasingly difficult computer opponents in an attempt to make players have to spend more coins to finish the entire ladder. This type of single-player mode would extremely accurately be coined as arcade mode, even through games today, and has become the absolute minimum of single-player content, which would be the only single-player mode for a surprisingly high amount of games, even now. Slowly over time, arcade mode started implementing story dialogue between matches, and finishing story mode could reward you with a longer, more detailed ending involving the character you won with. Eventually, as games began making their way from arcades to consoles, it became possible to include a true story mode, since developers weren't tied to the restraints of having to fit the format of coin-operated play. And that is when the truly cool single-player modes began appearing. In 2001, Guilty Gear would introduce its first true story mode in Guilty Gear X+, giving characters visual novel-like dialogue in between fights. A design choice that would remain common in anime fighting games for many years. Players could even follow different routes of the story in each character's story mode, with the outcome of certain fights deciding which path and ending you would go down. Soul Calibur 3, released on consoles in 2005, had without a doubt the most unique single-player mode seen in a fighting game up to that point, if not ever, called Chronicles of the Sword. Chronicles of the Sword was a single-player, story-driven mode that was a hybrid between a fighting game and real-time strategy games. Battles would take place on different maps, taking advantage of the in-depth custom character creation system in the game to give you varied fighters and opponents different from the main cast of fighters in the game. As you guided your characters around the map, fights would happen in both the real-time strategy mode as well as the classic Soul Calibur battles you would come to expect, causing you to gain or lose ground until you claim total victory. Soul Calibur 3 would also include a huge amount of unlockable options, including cosmetics and certain fighting styles for your created character, which tied all modes of the game together. Mortal Kombat as a series took a very unique approach to story mode in multiple ways over many years and many games, including being one of the few fighting game series to release specific single-player games, such as Mythology's Sub-Zero, Shaolin Monks, and Special Forces. All of these games were story-based games in the universe of Mortal Kombat designed for single-player or co-op. Tekken had a similar idea with Death by Degrees featuring longtime fighter Nina Williams. In 2004, Midway Games released Mortal Kombat Deception, the 6th game in the series and the 3rd in a row to feature 3D combat. Deception featured another new take for the single-player in Mortal Kombat, Konquest mode. Although the name Konquest mode had been used before, this iteration was completely different. A 3D exploration story mode where you played as a new character named Shujinko, able to copy other fighters' styles, allowing you to use their moves as you explore and meet characters from the Mortal Kombat universe. Story modes would radically change once again for Mortal Kombat games, beginning with Mortal Kombat 9, where a long story mode comprised primarily of cutscenes would resemble a movie more than a fighting game story mode. Reception for this type of story mode was extremely positive, and NetherRealm Studios continued to use this not only through the next 3 Mortal Kombat games, but also both Injustice games, based on the DC superheroes and villains. And of course, if we are talking about single player content in Mortal Kombat, and I didn't mention motor combat, I would probably be excommunicated from the community. A Mario Kart inspired racing mode included in Mortal Kombat Armageddon, fans have been clamoring for its return for almost 2 full decades. 20 years after Mortal Kombat Deception, a different company, Capcom, would have a similar idea to Conquest mode with Street Fighter VI, featuring their World Tour mode, a 3D exploration action RPG game mode in an open world map, where you play as your own custom character, leveling them up, giving them new equipment, and training under famous Street Fighter characters to learn their fighting styles. Not every game would go a more action-oriented direction, as games like Under Night In-Birth would take the visual novel direction that games like Guilty Gear or BlazBlue used in arcades and take it to the extreme. Chronicle mode is a story prequel to the arcade mode of the game, where you follow each character in their storylines leading up to the game, giving tons of backstory and setting the stage. Surprisingly, there is actually no combat within Chronicles mode, being a pure visual novel included in the game. A game genre that's been growing in popularity over the recent years are roguelikes, and some fighting games have even included that into their single-player modes, such as Idle Showdown, an indie game with an interesting history that we've previously released a full video on. In Idle Showdown single-player mode, Virtual Frontier, you go from node to node on a map, each one representing battles, events, or stores, where you battle opponents and power up your fighter. You collect individual items that help you along the way, but if you lose, your run ends, forcing you to start over once again. Fighting games have combined their single-player modes with visual novels, action RPGs, real-time strategy games, racing games, roguelikes, and more, blending the lines between genres in an attempt to break free from the stigma of fighting games lacking single-player content. What do you value most highly in a fighting game single-player mode? The story? The action? Silliness? The good news is that whichever you do prefer, there will always be a fighting game for you.